Imagine the weight of command, the burden of sending thousands of your soldiers to almost certain death, knowing that somewhere in the chain of decisions that led to this moment, a critical mistake was made. But by then, it was far too late to turn back. This is the story of Operation Jubilee, the Dieppe raid of August 1942, a day that would forever change how military planners understood the terrible cost of miscalculation, overconfidence, and a single overlooked detail that would spiral into one of the bloodiest defeats in Allied military history. On that cold summer morning in northern France, nearly 7,000 Canadian soldiers, British commandos, and American Rangers were about to learn a lesson in modern warfare that would echo through the rest of the war. And the price they paid would be measured in thousands of broken bodies, shattered families, and a nation's grief. For Canada especially, the Dieppe raid would become a national trauma, an event so devastating that it would haunt military planners for decades to come. And all of it stemmed from mistakes that began months earlier in planning rooms far from the sound of gunfire. In boardrooms where tired officers and ambitious commanders decided that a direct assault on a heavily fortified French port was not just possible, but necessary. The question that haunts military historians to this day is simple. How did such an obviously flawed operation ever get approved? The answer lies in a perfect storm of miscalculation, poor communication, inadequate intelligence, and the devastating overconfidence of men who believed that surprise and audacity alone could overcome superior German defenses. Let's rewind to 1942. A year when the Allies were desperate for any kind of victory, any sign that they could stand up to the Nazi war machine that had conquered most of Europe and seemed unstoppable. The Soviet Union was bleeding out on the Eastern Front, losing millions of soldiers in grinding attritional warfare, and Stalin was begging the Western Allies to open a second front in Western Europe to take pressure off his forces. The pressure was immense. The political stakes were enormous, and the desire to do something, anything, to show momentum against Hitler was clouding the judgment of commanders who should have known better. This is where the first seed of the mistake was planted, the decision to launch a major raid on the French coast, not because military necessity demanded it, but because political necessity seemed to require it. The original concept for the Dieppe raid was developed by the Canadian military, who saw an opportunity to test German defenses, gather intelligence about their fortifications, and perhaps most importantly, give the Canadian Corps something to do that would boost morale and prove that they were eager fighters. The goal on paper seemed reasonable enough. Conduct a large-scale hit-and-run raid on the port of Dieppe, destroy important targets, damage German installations, capture prisoners and intelligence documents, and withdraw before German reinforcements could arrive in overwhelming numbers. It was a classic commando operation in theory, the kind of thing that small elite units had been successfully pulling off against the Japanese and Italians. But Dieppe was different. Dieppe was in occupied France close to England, close to German-controlled territory, and close to German air bases. The geography of Dieppe itself was a warning that nobody heeded adequately. The town sits in a narrow valley, surrounded by towering cliffs on either side, with a small beach area that forms the only real landing zone. These cliffs were not just geographical features. They were perfect defensive positions, natural strong points that the Germans had recognized immediately and fortified extensively with artillery, machine gun nests, anti-tank guns, and barbed wire. The moment planners saw the maps and photographs of Dieppe, they should have recognized that a frontal assault from the beaches would be almost impossibly difficult. But instead of abandoning the plan, they convinced themselves that superior planning and audacity could overcome these obstacles. This is where the second critical mistake emerged: the decision to land troops without adequate preliminary bombardment. The Allies insisted that any large-scale bombardment of Dieppe would eliminate the element of surprise. which they believed was essential to the operation's success. But this was a catastrophic miscalculation, because surprise, it turned out, was actually impossible to achieve. The Germans had spotted the assembly of the invasion fleet in the English Channel. They had been alerted to the possibility of a raid, and they were waiting. The commander of the German forces in the area, General Konrad Haase, had actually received intelligence warnings about an impending Allied raid and had positioned his forces accordingly. On the morning of the assault, as the Canadian soldiers scrambled down the gangways of their landing craft and waded ashore, they were not landing on a beach that had been softened by bombing. They were running directly into the teeth of prepared German defenses that had hours, if not days, of warning that something was coming. The third mistake, perhaps the most crucial one, involved intelligence failures of staggering proportions. The planners of the raid had drastically underestimated the strength of German defenses, the number of troops available to defend Dieppe, and the speed at which German reinforcements could arrive. Intelligence reports had suggested that the German garrison at Dieppe was relatively light, perhaps 1,400 soldiers, but the actual number was closer to 5,000, and reinforcements were positioned near enough to arrive within hours rather than days. The planners had also failed to properly account for the effectiveness of German anti-tank defenses. They believed their tanks and infantry would be able to overwhelm the German positions. But what actually happened was that the Canadian and British forces ran into interlocking fields of fire, well-coordinated artillery, and devastating anti-tank gunfire that turned the narrow beach into a killing zone. The men who came ashore faced a situation where tactical surprise was gone, where fire superiority belonged entirely to the defending Germans, and where the narrow confines of the valley meant that they couldn't maneuver, couldn't flank, and couldn't escape the devastating fire coming from the heights above them. As the assault developed, it became increasingly clear that the operation was failing, but commanders on shore and in the ships offshore continued to commit more troops, more tanks, more men to a battle they could no longer win. This was the fourth critical mistake, the failure to recognize when an operation has fundamentally failed, and the decision to continue throwing men into the meat grinder in hopes of somehow pulling victory from defeat. The commander of the operation, General John Roberts, was coordinating from a ship offshore, receiving fragmentary reports about what was happening on the beach, and he faced an agonizing choice: withdraw the remaining forces and cut his losses, or continue the assault and hope that somehow, against all odds, the momentum could shift. He chose to continue, and that decision would cost hundreds more lives. The beach at Dieppe, throughout that terrible day, became a scene of almost medieval carnage. Canadian soldiers and British commandos were pinned down behind obstacles, using the bodies of their fallen comrades for cover, unable to advance more than a few meters without being cut down by machine gun fire. The cliffs towered above them, and from those cliffs, German soldiers and machine gunners poured devastating fire down onto the trapped men below. Tank crews, some of whom had never been in combat before, tried to maneuver their vehicles on the narrow beach, only to find them bogged down, immobilized, and transformed into burning coffins when German anti-tank guns found their mark. One Canadian battalion, the Royal Regiment of Canada, was nearly annihilated. Out of roughly 500 men who landed, only about 65 made it back to England, and of those, most were wounded. The slaughter was not just American tragedy or British tragedy. It was a specifically Canadian catastrophe that would shape Canadian national consciousness for years to come. By 11 a.m., it had become obvious to anyone with eyes to see that the operation was a disaster. The Allies had achieved almost none of their objectives. They had not captured the intelligence material they had hoped to get. They had not destroyed significant German installations, and they had certainly not proven that a permanent beachhead could be established in occupied France. What they had done was throw away the lives of nearly 3,600 men, killed or captured, for minimal strategic gain. Some military historians argue, and they have a point, that the intelligence gathered and the lessons learned from the failure of Dieppe were valuable. That the operation was worth its cost, because it taught the Allies what they needed to do differently for the eventual invasion of Normandy. There may be something to this argument, but to the families of the men who died on those beaches, to the widows and orphans left behind, to the young men who were captured and spent the rest of the war in German POW camps, that argument rings hollow. The immediate aftermath of the Dieppe raid was chaos and recrimination. Surviving officers tried to understand how such a well-planned operation had gone so catastrophically wrong. Investigations were launched, inquiries were held, and gradually a picture emerged of how multiple mistakes compounding upon each other had created a perfect storm of disaster. The intelligence had been wrong. The planners had underestimated German strength. The element of surprise, which was supposed to be the operation's greatest asset, had been lost before the first shot was fired. The geography of the target had been ignored. The towering cliffs had not been given adequate respect or resources. The preliminary bombardment had been skipped because planners believed that surprise was more important than softening the target, but they had been wrong about the possibility of surprise. The reinforcement situation had been misunderstood. The Germans could move faster and in greater numbers than anyone had anticipated. And perhaps most fundamentally, the operation had been approved not because sound military judgment said it was feasible, but because political pressure demanded that something, anything, be done to show the Soviets that the Western Allies were committed to opening a second front. For the Canadian military in particular, the Dieppe raid became a watershed moment. The Canadian soldiers who fought there had come to North America to defend democracy and prove themselves in the crucible of war, and they had shown extraordinary courage and determination on those beaches. But courage cannot overcome fundamental tactical and strategic errors, and determination cannot substitute for proper planning and realistic assessment of objectives. The raid had been a test of Canadian military capability, but it had been a test conducted under conditions that made success nearly impossible. The Canadian commanders came away from Dieppe understanding that modern warfare had changed, that the simple days of commando raids and quick strikes had given way to something far more complex and deadly. They learned that intelligence had to be accurate, that defenses had to be properly evaluated, that surprise was not always achievable, and that when the facts on the ground changed, commanders had to be willing to adapt and even abort operations that had been previously approved. These lessons, painful as they were, would inform Canadian military planning for the rest of the war. When the invasion of Normandy came in 1944, 2 years after Dieppe, the planners had learned the hard lessons that Dieppe had taught them. The invasion would involve massive preliminary bombardment, overwhelming air superiority, careful intelligence gathering that had been verified and cross-checked, realistic assessment of German defensive capabilities, and a willingness to accept that amphibious operations were incredibly difficult and required resources far beyond what had been committed to Dieppe. Normandy would succeed where Dieppe had failed, not because the soldiers were braver or more skilled, but because the commanders had learned from past mistakes and planned accordingly. The ripple effects of the Dieppe raid extended far beyond the immediate loss of life and the psychological impact on the Canadian military. The raid demonstrated to the Germans that an invasion of France was coming, which prompted them to accelerate their fortification of the Atlantic Wall, the massive defensive line that would eventually face the Normandy invasion. The Germans analyzed what had happened at Dieppe and drew conclusions about how to defend against amphibious assaults, conclusions that would influence their defensive strategy for the rest of the war. In some ways, the failure at Dieppe made the eventual successful invasion at Normandy more difficult, because the Germans had learned from the attack and had years to prepare. The human cost was staggering and immediate. In Canada, the casualty list from Dieppe was published in newspapers across the country, and entire small towns learned that their sons and brothers had died or been captured in a single disastrous day. Some units were decimated. Some regiments lost nearly all of their officers and senior non-commissioned officers. The loss of these experienced leaders would hurt the Canadian military for months, as replacement training had to be accelerated and new leaders had to be integrated into units that were grieving their losses. In addition to the Canadian soldiers who died, British commandos were also heavily casualties, as were the American Rangers who participated in the operation. The 1st U.S. Ranger Battalion, which had only recently been formed and was seeing its first combat action, suffered significant casualties during the assault. The raid was supposed to be a display of inter-Allied cooperation and shared determination to defeat Nazi Germany. And it was, but it was a terrible, blood-soaked display that left all the participants questioning whether their sacrifices had meant anything. The broader question that haunts military historians is whether the Dieppe raid was necessary or whether it was simply an expression of political desperation masquerading as military strategy. The Soviets wanted a second front in Europe, and the Allies wanted to show them that they were serious about providing one, but conducting a major operation that was almost certain to fail was not the way to demonstrate that commitment. The Allies could have shown their commitment through preparation, through building up forces, through planning for the eventual invasion. Instead, they showed it through a bloodbath that served no strategic purpose and from which no tangible military benefit could be extracted. Some historians argue that the experience of Dieppe, the knowledge of what went wrong, was worth the cost, that the lessons learned were invaluable for future operations. But this is a utilitarian argument that reduces human life to an abstract calculation, and it misses the fundamental point. The mistakes at Dieppe were not inevitable. They were not necessary to learn these lessons. They were the result of poor planning, inadequate intelligence, overconfidence, and political pressure. Had the planners been more careful, more skeptical, more willing to abandon the operation when the facts didn't support success, thousands of men would have lived. The command structure of the Dieppe operation reflects the organizational confusion that was common in the early stages of the war. The raid was supposed to be a Canadian show, and Canadian soldiers bore the brunt of the casualties. But the overall planning and coordination involved British commanders and American officers as well. This divided authority meant that responsibility for the mistakes was diffused, and clear lines of accountability were hard to establish. After the war, multiple inquiries and investigations would examine what had gone wrong, and while mistakes were identified, few individual commanders faced serious consequences for the disaster. This lack of clear accountability meant that the lessons of Dieppe could be debated rather than simply accepted and implemented. In the years after the war, Canada would still be processing the trauma of Dieppe, and the relationship between the Canadian military and political leadership would be shaped by the experience. Canadians had answered the call to fight for democracy, and they had done so with extraordinary courage and sacrifice. But the Dieppe raid seemed to demonstrate that their political leaders and military commanders did not always have a clear strategy or adequate respect for the lives they were committing to. Battle. This suspicion would influence Canadian military policy and Canadian political attitudes toward military intervention for decades. The Dieppe raid is a case study in how military operations can go catastrophically wrong, not because of cowardice or incompetence on the battlefield, but because of fundamental errors in planning, intelligence, and strategic judgment made in headquarters, far from the sound of gunfire. The men who fought at Dieppe were not failures. They were heroes who did their duty and paid with their lives. The failure belonged to the system, to the command structure, to the political pressures that drove the planning, to the intelligence apparatus that provided incorrect information, and to the planners who ignored warning signs and proceeded with an operation that should never have been approved. Decades after the war, survivors of Dieppe would return to the beaches where they had fought and bled, and they would remember not with pride in victory, but with sorrow for friends lost, with respect for comrades who had died, and with a kind of grim understanding that war is a terrible thing that sometimes demands impossible sacrifices from those asked to fight it. The memorial at Dieppe would become a place of pilgrimage for veterans and their families, a place where the names of the thousands who died or were captured would be inscribed, a permanent reminder that a single day of failure, born from a single catastrophic mistake in planning and judgment, had changed the course of countless lives. Today, when military planners consider amphibious operations, when they plan how to attack a fortified position, when they assess the intelligence they have about enemy capabilities, they are working within a framework that was shaped by the disaster at Dieppe. The operation failed, but from that failure came knowledge that has saved lives and led to better planning in every military around the world. It's a cold comfort to those who lost loved ones, but it is a kind of legacy that the sacrifice has not been entirely in vain, that the terrible lessons learned on those beaches have been applied and have made future operations safer and more likely to succeed. The Dieppe raid remains one of the most contested operations of World War II, debated by historians and military scholars who argue about whether it was a necessary trial by fire that taught essential lessons, or a preventable tragedy caused by political pressure and military miscalculation. What is not debated is the human cost. The 3,600 men killed or captured, the thousands of families forever changed by the loss of their sons and brothers. As we look back on Dieppe from the perspective of over 80 years, we are struck by how modern warfare had become, how complex and unforgiving it was, and how the romantic notions of commando raids and bold strikes had collided with the harsh realities of entrenched defenses, machine guns, and artillery. The men of Dieppe deserve to be remembered not just for the terrible price they paid, but for what their sacrifice ultimately meant. A watershed moment in the development of Allied military strategy, a moment when the harsh lessons of modern warfare were written in blood and learned through bitter experience. The mistakes that led to Dieppe were not unique to that operation. They were mistakes that many military operations throughout history have made. Mistakes born from overconfidence, poor intelligence, political pressure, and an underestimation of the enemy's capability to defend. But perhaps the Dieppe raid is remembered more vividly than some other failed operations, because it was so complete, so dramatic, and because the men who died there were primarily Canadian, and Canada has never forgotten the sacrifice. The raid is a powerful reminder that even the best intentions, even the bravest soldiers, even the most sophisticated military machinery cannot overcome fundamental errors in planning and judgment. It reminds us that war is not a game to be won through audacity and courage alone, but a brutal reality where careful planning, accurate intelligence, and realistic assessment of objectives are just as important as the fighting spirit of the men who carry out the plans. So there you have it, the full story of how one massive mistake, compounded by a series of smaller errors in planning, intelligence, and judgment, cost thousands of lives on a single day in August 1942. The Dieppe raid stands as a testament to the terrible cost of military miscalculation, and as a powerful reminder that even the most experienced commanders can be led astray by political pressure, overconfidence, and the fog of war. How did you like this deep dive into one of World War II's most tragic and instructive operations? The story of Dieppe is a sobering reminder of the human cost of war and the critical importance of getting the planning right. If you found this exploration of military history interesting and want to understand more about the decisions that shaped World War II, please let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether you believe the lessons learned from Dieppe were worth the terrible price that was paid, or if you think the operation was simply an unnecessary tragedy that should never have been approved. What aspects of this story resonated most with you? Was it the courage of the soldiers who fought there, the tragic miscalculations of the planners, or the way the operation shaped the future of amphibious warfare? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more long-form historical documentaries that explore the pivotal moments and crucial decisions that shaped our world. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in another video.